Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I talk a lot about books and literature, and this month I'm talking about Sherlock Holmes. There have been a lot of adaptations of Sherlock Holmes. A surprising number of those adaptations have been TV shows. It's actually pretty common for books to be adapted as TV shows, even though usually what people think of when they think of adaptations is movies. In the modern day, with things like Netflix and Hulu that make their own TV shows, some of which are based on books, and just in general, most Jane Austen fans, for instance, are familiar with the 1995 BBC miniseries of Pride and Prejudice, which, if you haven't watched it, go watch it, it's fantastic. However, I do think it's interesting that TV show format seems to work really well for the Sherlock Holmes stories as adaptations, and so I want to talk about that. In particular, I'm going to be talking about the TV series from the 80s and 90s with Jeremy Brett as Sherlock Holmes, the one from the 20-teens with Benedict Cumberbatch as Sherlock Holmes, and the one from the 20-teens with Johnny Lee Miller as Sherlock Holmes. These all are radically different takes on the Sherlock Holmes stories and very different ways of adapting them as TV shows, but all of them were relatively popular and successful. And I think there's a common thread in there, even though they're very different from each other, that makes them similar to each other in a way that the various movie adaptations are not. Movies are one big story, and TV shows are a series of short stories. That's basically what it comes down to. Now, of course, there are things like serialized TV shows where each season tells a complete story and each episode is like a chapter in a book. And that's a common format that's used when adapting books. However, the typical old-fashioned way of doing a TV show is that each episode on its own has a beginning, middle, and end and tells a complete story. And that's kind of what the Sherlock Holmes short stories do, like the original ones by Arthur Conan Doyle. There's not even like an underlying larger story there other than just the recurring characters and whatnot, and there are fewer of them than you might think. For instance, Irene Adler is not a recurring character in the original short stories. She only ever appears in one of them. But anyway, what I'm getting at is that when you take something like that, yes, there are a few novels, but most of the original stories are short stories, it works really well when you adapt it to a format that you can tell lots of individual stories. That might be that you're actually adapting those individual stories like the series from the 80s and 90s did. In that series, basically every episode was a very faithful to the original adaptation of a particular Sherlock Holmes short story. But even if you're doing something that's a little bit further removed, where you're putting different twists on things or telling new stories, just the fact that it comes from that sort of format, it seems like a logical way to adapt it. And so, for instance, Elementary, which I see as being the furthest removed from the originals of the three TV shows that I mentioned, because it makes significant changes to the setting and to Watson's character, and it really doesn't use storylines from the original stories. Sometimes it uses motifs or ideas, but not full storylines. So where I'm going with that, though, is that even though it's so far removed in terms of plot and setting, it still feels very much like reading the original Sherlock Holmes short stories in that it is a series of short mysteries that are all wrapped up by the end of that particular story or episode or whatever. On the other hand, I remember watching the 2009 Sherlock Holmes movie with Robert Downey Jr. as Sherlock Holmes and feeling very disappointed in it. And I couldn't quite put my finger on why at the time when I first watched it, but I think a big part of it was that the story that it was telling did not feel like a Sherlock Holmes story. It wasn't anything like any of the short stories or even the novels. It was much more complex, and a lot of that complexity didn't have to do with the mystery aspect of it, but more to do with adding a lot of action and violence to it. And I just remember feeling very disappointed by that, even though there were some aspects of it that I enjoyed. I feel like it's important to note that, as far as I can tell, most movie versions of Sherlock Holmes stick to the original setting and a relatively faithful interpretation of the characters, but the plot is usually a new one unless it's an adaptation of one of the novels, and there are only 4 of those. Whereas the 2 very recent and popular TV shows both went the route of modernizing the story, setting it in either present-day London or present-day New York City. I think it may be the case that because a TV series provides basically the same format of storytelling as the originals, the people who make them feel a little bit more free to experiment with other aspects of the story, Whereas because making a movie requires basically creating a new story that's not very much like the originals, it feels more necessary to stick close to the original characters and setting, and to do less experimentation there because so much else is already being changed. When it comes to public domain stories that have been adapted many, many times, especially if there's one adaptation that's considered to be extremely faithful to the original and well done, I tend to be a little bit less picky about faithfulness to the original when it comes to new adaptations of that work, particularly in contrast with how I feel about works that are still under copyright and that will probably only get one adaptation within our lifetimes. However, that doesn't mean that I don't have opinions about what makes a good or bad adaptation, as you might have seen with my discussion of the different adaptations of Jane Austen's Persuasion, which I will include a little link to. I tend to very much enjoy the adaptations of Sherlock Holmes that are faithful to the original, like, for instance, the series from the 80s and 90s starring Jeremy Brett. However, when it comes to radically changing the setting versus radically changing the plot and the style of storytelling, I do tend to prefer the former. There's something interesting to me about modernized adaptations that take older stories and put them in a new context, and because of that, there are differences. I enjoy things like BBC Sherlock and Elementary, particularly Elementary, not so much BBC Sherlock, but that's a different topic. Anyway, I enjoy stories like that in the same way that I enjoy something like the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, for instance. It's interesting to think about what something would look like in the modern day that was originally from a historical time period. I tend to not be such a big fan of things like Sherlock Holmes 2009, which basically took the idea of Sherlock Holmes, the characters, the setting, and whatnot, and created a story with it that didn't feel like a Sherlock Holmes story. To me at least, and this is definitely personal preference and not some kind of, all-encompassing rule for what makes a good adaptation, but in my opinion something like that is less enjoyable for me as a fan of the original than something that changes the setting but tells similar stories in a different time period. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Sherlock Holmes adaptations as a movie versus as a TV show. If you liked this and you want to see more from me, be sure to subscribe.